One thing I love about hosting this podcast is that we're always diving into the latest new payment trends, whether it's innovative technologies or creative new use cases. But sometimes it's useful to take a step back and look more at the big picture and think about the longer term overarching shifts that are really driving our industry. So let's do that now as we navigate digital payments.
Welcome to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline, bringing you the latest innovations, trends, and predictions about the future of payments.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Navigating Digital Payments podcast. I'm David Daly. I look after the Discovery Hub here at Worldline. And today I'm thrilled, in fact, to be joined by someone who is a real veteran of the payments industry. He has held senior roles in government, in banking, and for over a decade, he's been at the helm of Worldline. He is, of course, Worldline's CEO, Gilles Grapinet. Gilles, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, David. Thanks for hosting me here.
Really nice to have you here. And one of the reasons I was so keen to get you on the podcast was that you wrote this great foreword to the latest edition of the Navigating Digital Payments report. And in it, you describe these shifts in the driving forces behind the evolution of the payments industry. So I thought it would be really interesting, actually, for our listeners to hear more about that directly from you. But maybe before I come on to that, I'm always struck, Gilles, about just how passionate you are about everything related to payments. So maybe I could start by asking you, why is it that you find payments to be such a fascinating field?
Well, David, many thanks for inviting me here and also for providing me this opportunity, actually, to share, indeed, this paradox that in digital payments we always look forward, but sometimes to understand the future, it's really good to sometimes also look backward. And it's true that I'm passionate about this industry because this industry is a crossroad. It's really a crossroad. What I mean by that is that it is at the confluence of so many different moving pieces that you can never get bored in payments. In all fairness, you said I'm a veteran. I mean, I don't know if I am a veteran, but one thing is for sure, I've been spending, circa 20 years of my life looking in this sector, and I think I never get bored 1 minute within it. People are fascinating. The technology trends are reshaping it constantly. The regulatory trends are a big part of sometimes the untold piece that is also having a massive influence. It is also somehow becoming at the border of a big geopolitical pressure, because we see that, after all, payment is about making the currency circulating, and currency are never very far away from sovereignty topics, and we see that, of course. It is also at the crossroad between new business battles, between incumbent players and new entrants. And it is just a great space that every year, where we work with the Worldline teams and the partners and the customers, we see new things popping up in our lives. So really, for anyone listening, if you don't want to get bored, I guess there are some other sectors too, but payments you should not miss, really.
I think you're so right. I mean, sometimes when I look back at how payments were 20 years ago, and also when I think online banking, which was just in its very infancy back then, I mean, it is now almost unrecognizable. So yeah, you see a lot of change in 3 or 4 or 5 years, but actually over a slightly longer term, it's a complete transformation. And also, as you say, it's become, I think, so integral to society. I think people don't see paying digitally as a kind of optional extra or a nice to have when they visit a store. They see it as the way they'd like to pay most of the time, and they expect it to work. So it's really significant to how society operates now, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and not wanting to be rude to anyone here, but it's true that 25, 30 years ago, payment was seen, particularly within the banking ecosystem, as a very boring piece of the business. I mean, it was the type of back office activities or the IT-related platforms that were buried numbers of levels below the CEOs, and that had to run. That was it, and it was that period. But of course, to a certain extent, it was only a phase in a very long-term evolution. And businesses, sometimes they go through cycles, and there had been, indeed, in the 80s and 90s, a moment where payments were quite stable. in terms of products, in terms of ways of doing things. But it was only a temporary phase. It has changed enormously before, and it was about to change enormously after, as we see every day. And I hardly believe that we will have anywhere soon a type of new big stability phase. I think the era of stability is long gone now. It's why it is just passionate to be working into that sector. It is enlightening. It is also challenging. Let's be frank. You can never get it right every time, so you need also to accept in a business in payments to do trials, errors, and to learn from mistakes to get it right the next time, hopefully.
I think that maybe already starts to pave the way for the topic I really wanted to dive into, which was these shifts that you've seen in what's driving innovation in payments. So perhaps you can sort of give a summary of what you described in that forward and how you see those shifts have evolved.
Yeah, indeed, because, I happen to have this type of dual professional background. I've been in the civil service for 15 years of my life in the Ministry of Economy and Finance, so which is a type of big regulatory body of the economy at large, but also many segments of the economy, like banking and finance, of course. And I have a type of way to look at businesses having always an history behind them. I'm not the type of guy believing that everything you can invent on a blank page every day. Things have a DNA. Payment has a very strong DNA. And the real retail payment DNA is actually born into governance. If we look at it 2 millenniums ago, when people were paying with gold coins, silver coins, copper coins, name it, governments were controlling everything. They were controlling the entire ecosystem. They were minting the coin. They were printing the face of the king or the queen in the coin to give trust. And they were also distributing the coins. And they were forcing acceptance of these coins. And then when they invented banknotes, because it was more convenient to find paper than gold, obviously, it was the same story. It was a government state-controlled ecosystem. And then the big next shift was the advent and the invention of commercial banking, when people started to have their money within bank accounts. And then, without anybody deciding that, the big shift in retail payment happened, which was moving from a government-led ecosystem into a bank-led ecosystem. Because banks were, in the end, the new innovative forces of payments. They were inventing new ways of making money moving and being exchanged between individuals or corporate organizations. They were inventing the checks, the debit cards in the 70s and 80s. They've been inventing in between tons of payment instruments for wholesale banking or for retail banking. And in all fairness, we owe them a lot. And the last move is the one we have been experiencing over the last 20 years, where it came to this era of stability where a bank had invented everything we were using on a daily basis for our payment needs, from paper checks to quite advanced electronic payment system like credit cards with tons of added value services around. But to a certain extent, that was it. And the third big moment in payment is when technology did start to change commerce and where the globalization trends did also start to change the way commerce was done. Commerce became at the same time omni-channel, being able to be engaging with their customers on multiple layers of interaction, from physical shopping to very advanced and sophisticated app in your smartphone, but also became much more global than in the previous decades. And we saw in the last 20 years the true birth of global merchants, wanting to sell products or services literally in 200 countries in the world, and correspondingly asking the payment industry to support them. And in all fairness, then we discovered that banks that did so many great things in payments were, one, not global retail banks, and second, were not natively technology-driven firms. And when commerce became technology-driven and globally transformed, banks were facing much harder times to be the driving innovative force that could further help commerce to go to the next level.
It's really interesting. So you describe it as this shift from being government-led for centuries.
Literally.
And then bank-led for decades. And now we're in this new phase where it's really technology and the needs of global merchants that are driving how payments are implemented and delivered. But you also, in the forward, you mentioned that there are some aspects of payments that actually haven't changed. So amidst all the innovation, actually there are some fundamentals that have remained consistent throughout that. Do you want to say maybe a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well? And in between, if you allow me, David, it's the fact that each time such macro changes are happening from government-led, well, then you look at the production layers of payment that are national means, and of course, public agents and public agencies to distribute and then retrieve the payment coins and banknotes, to bank-led, where, of course, banks are building up large factories to support both the check printing, OCR reading of the checks, and then, of course, all what is related to card processing and issuing processing and authorization layers. The industry did reshape itself to follow the bank-led moment. And as we move into a technology and commerce-led ecosystem, of course, numerous new players are born to help these merchants and the technology to be implemented. Pure players like Worldline, tons of new fintechs, but also new payment brands and schemes. Think about PayPal. PayPal is born literally from the need of having an internet payment solution that was global enough to follow the need of the merchants. And of course, this has created a much more complex and vivid and vibrant ecosystem of new players on the side of the bank that are still a very important stakeholder. And it has created quite indeed a complex ecosystem. But rightly so, as you say, some fundamental characteristics of a solid payment solution have not changed. And number one is trust. Long ago, governments were somehow a really trustworthy counterparty. So we were given trust into government as a type of natural piece of the DNA of a government. Government were the organization that should inspire trust. Has it been the case in every country constantly? Probably not. But in general, yes, we trust our governments. They have general interest at the forefront of their mission. And you trust banks. Because banks, you trust them for your money. So it is a type of real given to the banks. And of course, they are accountable to keep this trust. And of course, as the industry is getting more complex and with new pure players that are far from being government-led organization or government-related organization, you need to constantly reinvent this trust while you are operating with commercial companies. And of course, it is a challenge in itself in the transformation of the industry. So trust has not changed. It is still an absolute prerequisite for any success in payments. Resilience for something that is about hundreds of billions of transactions a given year has to be always there, available, up and running, whatever the size of the organization claiming to deliver it. And the third piece is affordability. Nobody likes paying for getting paid or paying for paying. And so, obviously, you need to invent solutions that are having a fraction of the cost of the transaction they ultimately allow to take place. If not, they kill the business. So these are some of the key characteristics that are making this equation always fascinating to solve. High level of trust, super affordable in terms of cost, super convenient to use by everyone. This is what is making this industry really absolutely exciting to work into.
It is fascinating, and I think it's come up quite a few times on previous podcast episodes when we look at proposed new payment means or certain innovations we're seeing, that actually, if people don't trust it, if they don't believe their money will get to where it has to go, if it's very expensive, if it's not affordable, but also if they can't rely on it, if they can't access it, then it's almost doomed to fail. So these are kind of the ingredients, if you like, that are absolutely essential, no matter how revolutionary or clever or exciting or creative a payment means is. If it doesn't fulfill those basics, it'll never fly. I think we see that quite often. In a moment, I really want to ask you about, when you think about these shifts, how you think that's going to impact both merchants and consumers, but also the payment industry and the structure of our industry. And before I come on to that, I do just want to briefly remind our listeners that if they want to get in contact with the podcast, give us any feedback, suggest new topics for us to discuss, then you can reach us by emailing ndp-podcast at worldline.com. And of course, please take a moment, if you haven't already, to leave a review and a rating for us and subscribe to the podcast. So Gilles, when you think of these big shifts from government to then bank-led and now really meeting the needs of global commerce and using technology, what do you think is going to be the impact that's felt by merchants and consumers of that?
I genuinely believe that there are today many more brains working to solve these macro payment equations. It's good news for everyone. It means more innovation, more new products, more added value on top of just matching a debit and a credit, fundamentally trying to solve a type of dream in payment, which is making payment genuinely trustworthy and invisible in the way you actually pay. I don't want here to do advertising for a great firm that does not need me to do advertising, but Uber, the Uber experience, one of the reasons for which we loved Uber is I get in, I get out, and I know I paid, and I knew even before getting in the car the amount I would pay. I mean, this type of fantastic frictionless experience, which is making the purchase decision, not only the right one, but on top of that, the convenient one, and probably the fact that it is that frictionless, also a reason for which I was getting there. And I was picking up the Uber value proposition before it became a type of natural way of doing things these days, is exactly what every merchant would like to replicate in their own customer journey. So I believe we will get there progressively because we have more and more means and technology to solve this fascinating tension between maintaining trust, ensuring the counterparties that are dealing together are the right ones, having the proper rights to do this transaction, and at the same time allowing all these checks and controls that are taking place in real time or quasi-real time to be invisible in the way the customers are experiencing their actual purchase moment or paying moment. The fact that there are so many companies that are working in that space with money and people and talented brains will certainly help us to invent tons of new ways of doing things better than the way we do them today. The second trend in which I truly believe payment is going into a much more verticalized approach. Payment, as it was government-led, was a type of government product. It was the same for everyone. And when it was bank-led, somehow still, bank payment solutions were largely common between each and every vertical. The debit card was working the same for an online travel agency or for a small retailer. I think we are going into an era where we will invent much more verticalized payment solutions to better fit the need of specific vertical merchants. This is a very important evolution of an industry that was very horizontal and that is progressively becoming much more vertical. So these are a few elements, of course, that I can share with you, which is linked to this bubbling of number of companies working in the payment ecosystem, the fact that it has been shifting from centrally government-driven, then to bank-driven, and now being fundamentally the common child of so many different companies working somehow by different angles to try to bring and to create more value in the payment ecosystem is fundamentally good news for the societies, for our economies, because we will invent many more things together or separately as companies. But of course it comes with a price that payment has still to be accepted and recognized by billions of people. And so it needs also coordination, I think, between all these independent companies. And the way we can create also the proper level of coordination in the ecosystem while it becomes much more diverse and complex, I think is a new challenge for the industry.
I guess if I just unpick that a little bit, I think what you're saying, Gilles, is that it starts with the experience of the consumer, because merchants want to please their consumers, they want to boost conversion rates, they want consumers to use their products, and making payments as seamless and as frictionless as possible whilst still make it, and we've often said it on the podcast before, that ideally you don't want to even think about having to make a payment, but at the same time, you never want a payment to be made that you don't agree with. And that's the tension.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then I think what you're saying is that the new shape of the industry is attracting more companies, more minds to solving that conundrum. And ultimately that's good for merchants, but it is also good for consumers. They get a better experience. But as you also rightly say, it then creates this, we now have thousands and thousands of fintechs, all sorts of different use cases, new payment means, lots of things being launched. That creates a new kind of complexity, which wasn't there when, as you say, once upon a time, it was local banks managing local payments. I mean, it was a comparatively very simple ecosystem. Or what do you think that then means for the payment industry and how the different actors have to behave?
I think we must never forget the consumers. 30, 40 years ago, the consumers fundamentally may had to understand three things. Let's forget the checks. They had to understand their debit card. And in Europe, very often a national debit scheme and a carte bancaire in France or a Girocard in Germany or Pago Bancomat in Italy. So they understood that. They had to understand that Visa and MasterCard would allow them to pay in a foreign country. Okay, but fundamentally it was more or less what they knew with their national debit card. And they started to understand that on internet there was a type of form to be filled up to put their payment credentials somewhere. And that was it. If we fast forward that, of course they are now confronted on a typical internet payment page or even on a POS to tons of different signs and commercial brands. And we must not lose the customer in the creativity of the industry. Because ultimately we come back to the fundamentals. Trust, convenience, affordability. If I lose 5 minutes to understand exactly what is a buy now, pay later solution, exactly who will charge me what happens if I don't honor a given installment because I choose a buy now, pay later solution, I just refrain from purchasing. So I believe the industry as it gets, and that's good fundamentally, more complex, more vibrant, more decentralized, needs somehow also to keep a very strong habit that banks gave it, which was to work in common. Bank had this DNA of being a community locally. They knew how to collaborate, to educate the market, to put standards, to interoperate. We should keep really that very strong DNA from the way banks were shaping the payment industry, which is to look at it as a structured ecosystem with open innovation, looking for standards, asking sometimes the regulators to set common rules that everyone will obey. I'm sorry to become technical one sec, but if you look at PSD2, Payment Service Directive number 2, open banking, I mean, it was a great initiative. It did not go as far as it could have because there was no standards to allow third-party access to your bank account because there were 7 or 8 different protocols that ultimately between web scraping to automated interaction were quite complex to operate. So this industry, as it become more vibrant and different and diverse and decentralized, need also standardization so as customers still understand easily the way it works. Whoever offer what great value proposition, in the end, it stays understandable. And I don't need to do reading 5 internet pages of contracts to get it done. And from that standpoint, I truly believe that we must all together in this industry pursue collaborating, going into advocacy bodies, shaping common working groups on certain topics to make sure we don't lose our customers in our creativity.
It reminds me that on a previous episode, someone mentioned the fact that when contactless was first launched, there had to be a big communication and marketing effort to convince consumers that this was a reliable and safe way to pay.
Sure.
And I think the context of that comment was PSD2 and the fact that so far there's not really been that campaign, if you like, to onboard members of the public, to trust it, to understand what it means, the level of protection they do or don't have. And there certainly isn't a consistent branded button or something that you push on when you pay, if you do pay by bank transfer. So I think it highlights exactly what you're saying, Gilles, that it's great to have this very diverse and rich industry, but at the same time, that complexity can create problems for consumers, and they need to know fundamentally what can they trust, what can they use, and how will it work.
And if you just allow me to step in 1 sec on this one, I think if we look at the crypto phenomenon, and because it was cryptocurrencies, upfront the use case was to pay with it, and ultimately did not become, at any large scale anywhere, a large retail payment instrument or method. And I believe one of the reasons for that is that there were so many different cryptos, number one. They were operating so differently, each from the other one. They were having such a different value proposition. and there was no coordination to make it a payment instrument. So ultimately, consumers may have bought some Bitcoins or Ethereums or whatever, but it was just as a speculative asset, but certainly not for making it a way to pay in their daily lives, because it was exactly the contrary of what we should do in payments. In payments, you need somehow standardization and coordination, and you need market education and distribution. None of that was available for the cryptos, so it did not become a retail payment instrument.
I actually inherited a small amount of Bitcoin from my dad, and he had been holding it in an unsecure wallet, and I thought, okay, I should move this to a better wallet. So I had to make a Bitcoin transaction, and I realized that all you do, you trigger the transaction and then you wait. And if it goes wrong or it doesn't appear, there's no one to phone. And I kind of realized that actually, I mean, maybe for trivial purchases, you can be quite relaxed. But if you were buying a house, it's important. You want someone to phone if the transaction hasn't worked. So this idea of eliminating the middleman or the third parties sounds nice until you actually want to make a transaction of any significance, at which point you really want to know that there are guarantees and there are people you can call if there's a problem.
Which is part of what we call systemic trust. Typically, the example which I find fascinating that you take here, that is your own experience, is all about trust. In the end, it is one of the factors of trust. I need to be sure that I am paying X from A to B, and it is exactly X that will be debited, and it will be X that will be credited. But somehow I also know, and it is part of my trust factor here, that indeed, if an incident happens, there will be a process to manage it. The transaction will be replayed, cancelled, or whatever. And this is the systemic trust that is also coming with regulation, standardization, and coordination of the ecosystem, which was absent in the very valid example you give here of a Bitcoin transaction, because precisely it wanted to be outside of any rule book except the code of the Bitcoin platform. And what we learn here is that whatever good the concept may be, and I recognize that decentralized ledger, shared ledger technology are just great technologies, but it is not enough in itself a good piece of technology to create a payment solution. That's for sure. We need coordination between the various stakeholders. We need regulation somehow, whether we like it or not. Trust also has something to do with the fact that we know it is regulated. I don't say public regulation constantly. It may be private regulation, but properly coordinated between the stakeholders. And indeed, as you say, in case of an issue, someone to phone.
Someone to call if there's a problem. I do in a moment just want to ask you maybe what you think could be some of the unexpected changes on the horizon for payments. But before that, we've talked about this shift away from government-led, but recently we've seen this phenomenal rise of alternative payment means, and I have in mind PIX in Brazil, UPI in India, but also, we're now at the, I would say, the concrete early stages of the digital euro. And all of these are, to a greater or lesser extent, government-initiated programs. So do you think, does that mark a swing back to more of a government-led ecosystem? What's your view on that, Gilles?
This is really a very valid question, because it reminds us that history is not going into one direction only most of the time. It may make loops, and it can go back sometimes for good reasons. I believe what we just discussed, this indeed structural, historical shift from a government-led payment ecosystem to bank-led payment ecosystem. But keep in mind that banks, even commercial banks, were heavily regulated by public authorities. To operate a bank, you need a bank license, and the bank license is given by the local public central bank. And somehow it gave governments a feeling of control on what was happening within. Even if banks were extremely creative when it came to retail payments, it was still in a relatively pyramidal or hierarchical concept of governments regulating banks being very innovative, creating tons of instruments. The era in which we are, where payments are becoming much more private, commercially driven, technology driven to serve the need of commerce, has also given governments probably a feeling that they may have stepped too much away from this big picture, and that somehow they have also still a role to play. And this is why I tend to believe indeed that this comeback of public-led initiative, where governments are launching, you mentioned PICs, but indeed UPI in India, what has been initiated in many countries around central bank digital currencies, is also clearly a message from public authority that they do consider that when it comes to payments, ultimately it goes beyond pure private interest. We talk here about a pillar of their national economies. They want always to have a type, at minimum, of a resilient solution in case the private initiatives are not going the way they should. They should always stay a type of public rail available to get payment done if need be. And sometimes also they do it because they believe that the private sector is not innovative enough and it relies too much on well-established solutions like rents. And they want also to challenge somehow also maybe some too stable situation viewed from their windows, where both technology and the capacity to get things evolving should also take place. So I tend to look at governments indeed coming back into our equation after having let a lot of good things happening, because they want still to be part of the picture, as I believe banks want to still be part of the picture. But the strategy of the banks is changing these days. They still want to be a very strong partner to merchants, but they do recognize that the weight of technology, the speed at which innovation is taking place, is going probably beyond most of the banks' capacity to follow. And the fact that they have been shifting their strategy to do partnerships or strategic partnerships with companies like Worldline or Nexi, our Italian counterpart, or in the US with our US peers, to create joint ventures between banks and pure players in payments, is also telling you a message that banks do recognize if they want to stay in the big picture, they need to do it differently than in the past decades. But it is also saying they want to stay in the picture because they believe they have something to bring to solve the big equation we discussed, and I believe it's true. They can bring trust, distribution power, relevance in many, many regions, because payment is also about being distributed and operated sometimes in very small cities everywhere. It is not only something for the geeks, it has to work for everyone.
Absolutely. Maybe just one final question, Gilles, that I think would be really interesting to get your view on. Obviously, one of the reasons to look at the big picture and the trends over a long time period, as you said, is that it helps you to imagine what's coming in the future. Do you think there's anything on the horizon that perhaps people aren't expecting, or that people will be surprised by in the world of payments?
I believe there will be a few big things, of course, and I don't want to fall too easily into today's fashion of artificial intelligence. But if you look at payments, I believe that AI can really help payments to go to a next level of convenience. Particularly if we start to think about digital currencies, that could be, for example, programmable money that can be used in certain situations and that cannot be used in other situations, can probably be a very, very useful and interesting field of play. Let me give you a very basic example. Let's imagine tomorrow we have a digital euro. You give digital euro to your child of 12. And you know by design that these particular digital euros cannot be spent on certain types of adult-only purchases. You have the safety that you give something to a child that cannot be used to pay for something that a child should not get access to. Same with, of course, public subsidies that you could distribute to millions, being sure that these public subsidies would only be used to buy the goods or services that they are supposed to support: housing, food, energy, whatever. I think programmable money can be a big next step to allow at the same time convenience and proper tracking. I think also that we should not forget that we are in an era of geopolitical tension, and I believe that payment will be probably much more sensitive in the years to come to these very high-level strategic political agendas of not that much one government, but I would say of regional blocs. We see that already around the digital currency between China, US, Europe, and so on. And we should also accept that as we are working in a field of trust highly related to the good functioning of our societies and economies, we owe also our contribution to our governments in the ways they see the world evolving, and being sure that we can always support our authorities in providing, where it makes sense, payment solutions that are also a contribution to our independence and sovereignty if governments are telling us it is important, they believe. And so we should not be naive. Payments is also a part of a big battle between large currencies in the world and large superpowers. And rather than resisting to that, thinking that it is only about private sector initiative, we need to also accept that payment is connected to society and cannot evolve without being aligned with society's interest. It goes a bit beyond technology, David, here I do recognize, but it loops back to what we started with. Never forget that payment is born with governments, and somehow governments will always keep an eye on it, and we need also as an industry to be able to voice our concern when it is really not going in the right direction with limited benefits for the government stakes. But when it is really something that is making sense and that is about public interest and general interest, we need also to be part of solving that issue alongside the governments, voicing what we feel is right as an industry, but not forgetting that somehow payment is never far away from the currency, and the currency is never far away from the public interest.
So Gilles, I must say that has been absolutely fascinating. It's been wonderful to hear you talk through these shifts that you've seen in your own words and add a lot of rich information to it. I think it was also very nice actually to talk about what does that mean concretely for merchants and for consumers, what changes are they going to see. And interesting, I think, as you say at the end, to see that, of course, it's not a shift in the sense that governments stop being interested and banks start being interested, and then banks stop being interested and e-commerce providers start being interested, but actually it's more overlapping than that, or one building on the other and kind of going in cycles and tipping one way and then reversing a little bit. So I think it's been really interesting to cover all of that with you. Thank you, Gilles, so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, David. Thank you to the listeners. And hopefully, indeed, as you rightly said, let us know the feedbacks.
Absolutely. And yes, as you say, my final thank you always goes to our listeners for joining us once again as we navigated digital payments.
Thank you for listening to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline. Join us next time to learn more about the latest innovations, trends, and predictions for the future of payments.